Hey, it's your guy Tyrrell back with the interviews. In today's video, we're going to briefly analyze the main tactical theme predominantly in the first half of Arsenal's 3-1 win over Man United. So in today's video, first we're going to focus on Arsenal's pressing, then we'll quickly touch on how United attempted to press Arsenal from the front, and lastly we'll focus on Arsenal's second half. So when we break it all down and we do look at the board, we have Arsenal in the 4-3-3 and Man United starting in a 4-2-3-1, and a lot of this first half was down to Arsenal's pressing that disrupted United from creating chances, and specifically their game plan to get the ball out to Marcus Rashford in 1v1 situations. With United now possessing a goalkeeper that was competent on the ball and capable of playing out of the back, it would be interesting to see how Arsenal would approach this game. In terms of their pressing from the front, the battle in the midfield was clear. It was Havertz against Casemiro, Odegaard against Eriksen, and Rice dealing with the movement of Bruno. But what ended up happening was that now you have 3v1 against Nketiah, and at times you'd end up seeing Nketiah dealing with Lissandro, and if Havertz stepped towards Lindelof, he'd end up blocking off the passing lane into Casemiro, or you'd see Odegaard stepping forward to close down Casemiro in that regard. There were situations where Eriksen dropped in towards his own third to get on the ball and Odegaard couldn't step, and that's where you'd see Havertz stepping towards Eriksen but blocking off the passing lane in towards Casemiro. And then the same would be applicable if Lindelof got on the ball and Nketiah stepped towards him. Lissandro would be the free man. You'd see Saka tucking in a bit narrow in towards a central position, and then that would leave Delo free down the left-hand side of the pitch, and Saka would have to shift out towards him if he did receive the ball. But Arsenal were ensuring that they applied pressure towards the center backs, and that would ultimately leave Onana with more time on the ball. But whenever he looked to step forward, Arsenal would apply pressure towards him, and it would often be Nketiah applying that pressure, and that's where you would see Odegaard or Havertz stepping towards Casemiro. As the first half progressed, there were times where Arsenal's pressing roles varied, and there were times where you ended up seeing Nketiah and Havertz simply stepping towards the center backs and forcing the ball back to Onana, or even scenarios where it was Odegaard pushing forward to close down Lissandro, and then you'd see Havertz sitting on Casemiro in a deeper position as well. If it happened that Havertz and Odegaard were on opposite sides of the pitch, you could see Havertz stepping forward to close down Eriksen and Odegaard pushing out towards Lindelof. But it was evident that Mikel Arteta didn't want the center backs to have any time on the ball or Casemiro to drop off deeper in towards the defensive bank to get on the ball freely. When Onana did get on the ball in situations, you ended up seeing Nketiah applying late pressure towards him, and it was clear within the opening 10 minutes that United were trying to play diagonal balls out towards Marcus Rashford, but in each scenario that those balls were played, it was Ben White winning those aerial duels easily. When Martial dropped off deeper in that opening half, he was often closed down by Gabriel and forced to play the ball back towards his midfield. The same was applicable for Antony down the right-hand side on the touchline, but as that game progressed, what you ended up witnessing was that he tucked in a bit narrow into the gap between Zinchenko and Gabriel, and from there he was more successful receiving the ball and helping retain it in the midfield zone. Antony would probably benefit if Wan-Bissaka was capable of tucking into narrow central roles and invert so that it could create space for him to receive the ball more freely in that wide touchline area. Arsenal's pressing, discipline, and work rate out of possession was effective, and as we got towards the end of that first half, it was Eriksen, Casemiro, and Bruno dropping in towards their own half and ultimately their own third to get on the ball to help United push forward. And outside of diagonal balls out towards Rashford, they struggled to build play from deeper positions. That was bittersweet for Arsenal given the fact that Eriksen intercepted Havertz's tame pass towards Odegaard to spring the United attack that saw him play a ball in between White and Saliba to allow Rashford to break free down that left channel, and in the 1v2 with Rashford carrying the ball in towards the Arsenal penalty area, he was able to cut across both defenders to put United ahead. And then later on in that half, it was Eriksen picking up the ball around the halfway mark and switching it out towards Rashford, who received it near the touchline, and from there he played the ball around White for Dalot, making a run towards the byline, and then from there Dalot was able to pull the ball back towards a legitimate goal scoring position that helped United win a corner. So it was United's midfielders dropping off in towards their own half or away from pressure in the midfield zone as Arsenal's pressing decreased that helped them get into better positions in Arsenal's third by playing switches out towards Rashford. But for the most part, they did a very good job of disrupting United from creating chances in that opening half. With Zinchenko featuring in the starting 11 for the first time this season, it was going to be interesting to see how him and Rice would operate in that midfield duo. And in the early stages, it was Zinchenko picking up the ball on the right-hand side, side. And here United's attempt to combat Arsenal's superiority in that midfield zone was to replicate what was successful in their preseason win against the Gunners. They wanted to ensure that Rice and Zinchenko didn't have time on the ball, and that would see Martial helping out Bruno in that midfield zone, with Antony tucking in as well. So Antony would tuck in to help Bruno close down Zinchenko or Rice, and then you'd see Martial sticking towards the other midfielder and being prepared to push out towards the center back. So in these situations, United were able to overcome Arsenal's box midfield with Antony and Bruno's work rate, as Martial and Bruno did a very good job of closing down Rice and then closing down the center backs and blocking off the passing lane in towards Rice, and Antony tucking in towards that zone to help out close down Zinchenko or Rice on the rare occasion. That would leave space out towards the touchline zone for Martinelli to receive the ball freely, as there was so much space with Antony tucking in central, but his high positioning often left Arsenal not going down that route. However, there was a time where it was Gabriel splitting Martial and Antony, with Martial sticking on Rice for Martinelli dropping off into that midfield zone, and he did a very good job of dragging out Casemiro, holding off his pressure, and then switching the ball out towards Saka. That would be the benefit of having Martinelli dropping into that zone that Antony left vacant. However, unfortunately for Arsenal fans, they didn't see that on a consistent basis. With Arsenal's 3-2-5 often pegging back Casemiro and Eriksen in towards the United backline due to the positioning of Odegaard and Havertz, with Havertz now dropping off into that midfield zone, what ended up happening was that now Casemiro could push higher up the pitch to close him down and do more work in that area, and now it allowed Antony to shift out towards the wider area to provide more protection for Wan-Bissaka to ensure that he wasn't overloaded in that area. And where Havertz didn't have much of an impact in that deeper area progressing the play, what you can say is that he was involved in the build-up to Arsenal's equalizer, as it was his positioning that pulled Casemiro out in towards that midfield area, and Antony simply being bypassed by Gabriel that allowed Zinchenko and Martinelli to get that overload against Wan-Bissaka. And you could see Casemiro looking to recover, but Nketiah was already beyond him, and he played a quick pass into Martinelli, who picked out Odegaard's late run towards the penalty area, and he dragged three defenders towards him and pulled the ball back for Odegaard to sweep a first-time effort beyond Onana. And equally, if Rice was caught higher up the pitch and Arsenal lost possession, then that would leave a lot of space for Rashford to break down the left channel, and that was what we saw in the build-up to United's opener. At the same time, with Rashford being a willing tracker, Arsenal failed to create overloads down that side, as you had Rashford and Dalot dealing with White and Saka, and then you had Eriksen shifting over to deal with Odegaard, and the only time where they did look like much of a threat was if Rice was able to push forward and make runs beyond Bruno, but we didn't see that on a consistent basis. In the case that Martial had to step out towards Saliba per se, you'd see Bruno pushing towards Rice, and then you would have Antony tucking in towards the spare midfielder. So in many cases, it would be Martial on Rice, Bruno and Antony occupying Zinchenko, and then you'd have Eriksen pushing forward to deal with Odegaard. There were times where Arsenal were more of a 4-1-5 with Zinchenko near the touchline zone, and that's where you'd see Kai Havertz dropping deeper to help Arsenal build out of the back and bypass that press. But there were situations where Arsenal were able to get that pass in towards the midfielder between Bruno and Antony, but that would often lead to a mistake in the midfield zone. For instance, there was a time where Saliba played the ball across Martial to split Antony and Bruno, and that's where Kai Havertz received the ball in that midfield zone, and when he received it, he looked to play it into the path of Odegaard running off Eriksen, but it was Eriksen who stepped in to intervene. And then there was another time where Saliba looked to play the ball around Bruno, who was closing down Rice, and you could see Martial and Antony blocking off the passing lane in towards Zinchenko, and when that pass was played into the path of Zinchenko, it was Antony stepping in to intervene and win possession. Ultimately, the roles for United's pressing was clear, and they were pretty effective. It was Rashford closing down Ben White, Martial helping out Bruno and Antony with Zinchenko and Rice, but if Saliba did get on the ball, you would see him stepping out towards him, and then Antony would be tasked with closing down Gabriel if Zinchenko moved into that midfield zone, and he'd attempt to block off the passing lane in towards the midfielder. But in many cases, it would be one of Bruno or Antony stepping towards Rice and the other dealing with Zinchenko, unless Kai Havertz was in that midfield zone, because Zinchenko was operating as a left back on the touchline, and that's where you would see Antony closing down Havertz in that role. However, outside of United's pressing, Arsenal did have majority of the ball in that opening half. Over on the right-hand side, Saka struggled to get the better of Delo in 1v1s, and there was minimal rotation down that side. When White was making overlapping runs, he either wasn't played in, or when he was played in, the crosses weren't very great. And from that zone, you ended up seeing some poor passes from the Arsenal players that were looking to play in their teammates making movement in behind the fullback. Nketiah was dropping off into that midfield zone to serve as an outlet and spread play out towards the wider areas, whilst also dragging away one of the center backs, and that would create space for Odegaard and Havertz to make sharp darts into the space behind him. But Arsenal's best moments came down the left-hand side, specifically when Martinelli was able to get in behind Wan-Bissaka. But out in that left-hand zone, he was often in 1v2s with Antony doing a good job of tracking back. But when he was in 1v1s, Wan-Bissaka was showing him towards the byline, and there were occasions where Martinelli was capable of getting the ball towards that zone and getting crosses in towards the box. It was Martinelli's 1v2 against Bruno and Lindelof that attempted to see him play the ball in towards Odegaard's late run in towards the box, but it resulted in Delo nodding the ball into the path of Kai Havertz, who scuffed his effort from point-blank range. In a 1v1 against Wan-Bissaka, he attempted to pick out Saka, making a run towards the back post, but it forced a heroic header from Dalot. So as you can see, although Arsenal experienced some second half issues that we'll discuss in tomorrow's video, it was clear that the pressing in the first half disrupted the away side's ability to create. However, despite Arsenal's territorial and possession dominance, they're still struggling to consistently create high quality chances in the final third.